The next speaker we have is Imran Manzoor, and he is a founder of Breaking the Silence, a psychotherapeutic program founded in West Yorkshire, but is now operating nationally all across the country. So this organisation supports the male survivors from racialised communities who experience trauma and abuse in their childhood. This session will focus on preventing dissent, looking at the pre-crime industry where national security overlaps with mental health. Thank you. Round of applause, please.
It's working. Am I on? Can you hear me okay? I'm just going to start by saying how discombobulating the experience of London can be. Yesterday I took the 153 from Clerkenwell up to Holloway Road. This morning to get here I took the number 8 bus. In both instances, somebody sat next to me on the bus. I literally stared because I was in shock. Now, in case you haven't guessed, in case it's not apparent, I'm from West Yorkshire, up north. And it's pretty tense at the moment, given the last few months, given everything that's happened. I took a bus yesterday to get to the train station to get down here. I had 4 seats to myself on a bus that was packed. People would rather stand. So then I end up finding myself policing my own behavior, soften the smile, hide the bald head, whatever it takes to make people think you're not that terrifying. And then there's another part of me that says, no, don't bother. Don't do it. Stay sat down. You don't need to offer the seat to anybody. If they're afraid, it is not your problem. So London, whilst I'm sure has many problems, it's certainly very different to life up north. Things are incredibly tense. I've come back from Middlesbrough just a week ago. There was a pogrom, an attempted pogrom in Middlesbrough. An entire community burnt out of their homes, essentially, windows smashed. And we're supporting several of those families who experienced the trauma. And it's interesting as well, I'm somebody who's lived through this about 4 times now. So the younger generation, like, oh my God, racism, it's like a real thing. It's like, yeah, every 10 years, it'll come back again, then it'll die down, it'll be embarrassing, and then it'll come back. And it works in these cycles. But I'm here anyway to talk about the delightful PREVENT agenda. When terrorism evolved as an object of study from counterinsurgency studies in the mid-20th century, one of the central changes was to do with the idea of being rational. Counterinsurgents had previously been seen as morally deplorable, but rational. They were rational. The introduction of terrorism reframed political violence as irrational. It erased the idea of political agency. And it framed the violence instead as a moral evil in and of itself. Now, irrationality is the purview of what? Mental health. The profession that I work in. So now an individual's cognitive distortions, rather than their political demands, became the locus of the intervention. Yet the evidence to associate mental health with political violence is poor. It's very limited. In fact, a 2018 study said that actually it was social deprivation and a sense of injustice that pushed people over the edge, not mental health. And yet, the PREVENT policy and training insists we use this psychological frame. They have determined that this is a pre-crime space or a pre-criminal space. The UK's Prevent Counter-Radicalisation policy, which is a strand of the UK's counter-terrorism legislation or strategy, attempts to identify pre-criminals. In fact, let me just say that the UK is literally the only country in the global north to now place this as a duty upon all of its major institutions, from education to health. And each one of those provisions, including schools, are accountable to the government. They have to measure against it to determine how many radicals they've identified in the school, what kind of work they've done to prevent radicalisation. I apologize. There is French speakers in the room, so I apologize. Prevents raison d'etre is to identify individuals who are susceptible to developing an intent, just an intent to commit political violence, not now, but in the future. In order to search out the perfect or the pre-symptomatic individual who might present future threats to the social order, what did they do? They consolidated human factors. So what did we find? Anxiety, depression, various disorders, concepts such as exhibited anger or the impact of mental health issues. These are all found in the manual. These are the things that teachers and healthcare workers should be looking for. In doing so, mental health has now become a panacea for national security. It was in this therapeutic rhetoric. My slides have gone. Would you? Oh, okay, there we are. Okay. Stop. Thank you. Right, where was I? Okay, so it was in this therapeutic frame that the archetypal pre-symptomatic psychological profile could be found. Let me give you an example. One of the manuals says it could be an adolescent who loses confidence or an adolescent who gains confidence. It's true. It's actually written there. Surely hallmarks of any adolescent's, existence, the gaining and losing of confidence. But prevent trainers were instructed to associate all emotional and behavioral signs with vulnerability. In so doing, it allowed the government to house counter-radicalization within safeguarding. Now, safeguarding is a framework that's designed for people with significant physical and emotional ailments or psychological ailments, things like dementia. Do you think young men who are motivated, or young women who are motivated by political violence necessarily fit these parameters? More often than not, no, they didn't. But because they didn't meet these parameters, the teacher, the care worker was told, when they would say, well, clearly they don't meet this. Instead, what they would do is say, okay, just trust the channel team, the prevent team, refer it to the police anyway. Let them make the final decision. Because what was happening was teachers were looking and saying, okay, this individual doesn't meet these criteria, we're not going to refer them. So the prevent training went one step further and said, no. You can't make that decision. Send them to us. The government justified counterterrorism's integration into the NHS based on the number of patients who had passed through. Every time you visited your doctor, every time you entered the school space, you were now being monitored, consciously or unconsciously. It allowed for mass surveillance. Prevent training emphasized the centrality of relying on your intuition, your gut feeling. They said in the training manual, use common sense and let the channel or prevent lead make the final decision. Trust your gut feeling that something's not right and refer every minuscule of concern. Let's give you some examples of those. A non-Muslim refugee from the Middle East who was referred for no other reason other than having come from the Middle East. A 6-year-old, and I was involved in this, who said at school that he came from, or he lived in a terrorist house. He mispronounced the word terrorist. For that, the entire family was under investigation. The fact that in school they were studying Victorian buildings didn't really come to bear on the investigation. A Muslim was referred for having gone to Hajj. A disabled Muslim adolescent was referred to prevent when a nurse who was doing a home visit found that he was watching an Arabic video on YouTube. It just happened to be in Arabic. By the way, it turned out he was Christian, so it was okay. We're all right, nothing to worry about. complicated, but Arab Christians speak Arabic, and they call God Allah, which really does confuse things, I guess. A Muslim patient who told his GP he was contemplating homeschooling his children. The doctor was confronted with this thought. Is he pulling his children out because he doesn't want to integrate in wider society? As it happened, the doctor was very critical of Prevent and decided not to refer them. But they were conflicted at this point. Am I amiss of my legal responsibilities here? So it blurred the line between risk and vulnerability. The channel mentors, who are charged with ideological reprogramming, that's really what it's called, admitted, very Orwellian terms, that referrals were often founded on banal behaviours amongst individuals who pose no risk whatsoever. So this raised the question of their inclusion in a police database. The insistence upon using your intuition conveniently bypassed the need for any criminological profile. You didn't need it. The government decided they were going to go down the route of what's called psychologization. Psychologization is the phenomenon in which psychology is used outside the remit that we use it in my profession, because it transforms social problems into individual problems. Now, this is important. By localizing them within the individual, it helps sustain the idea of colorblindness. Why? Because it's not about any one race or ethnicity. It's about cognitive distortions. And this is where the race frame operates. So there's a hegemonic association in society between Muslims and terrorism, right? In the public consciousness. Because politicians framed extremism as being dissociated from race, they can't be held accountable for mass surveillance of Muslims. It's not about Muslims, it's not about Muslims, it's about individual Muslims. It just so happens a lot of the people who we detain for this happen to be Muslim, but we're not arresting them because they're Muslim, we're arresting them because they all happen to have individual cognitive distortions, separating it, therefore, from the idea of racism. Unions, NGOs, etc., needless to say, disagreed very strongly. How am I doing time-wise? Can I take a brief detour into race and racism? Brief detour. I'll be quick as I can. The previous administration, through the commission, what was it called? Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, CRED, it had none, literally, suggested that racism was no longer hegemonic, and actually that racism no longer belonged in institutions, but belonged to those on the periphery of society, the Tommy Robinsons of this world. At least we're not them, they're the real racists. It's not us. Boris famously said he wanted to end the sense of victimization. Tony Sewell, the chair, said he warned against a sense of victimhood engendered by the notion of institutional racism. And yet, government policies, whether it was hostile environment, whether it was counterterrorism, whether it was muscular liberalism, suggested people like me are inherently violent, suggested that we were incompatible with wider society, and, as far as I'm concerned, embedded fear and suspicion of people like me in the national institutions. The media played its role in painting us as others, backwards and threatening, and of course, it followed this narrative. In government discussion as well, when violence is justified, who can cross borders, whose death deserves an inquiry, and whose citizenship was a right. A study by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding found that stories about Muslims, where the perpetrators were perceived to be Muslim, received 7 times more media coverage. Anyway, back to Prevent. So, Prevent training took this pedagogical approach to its trainers, so you would all attend this session and I would teach you how to go out there and find terrorists or identify behaviors that might lead to terrorism. It presumed the logic of racial prejudice in all of you could be trained away. It reified the locus of racial prejudice as being in you as individual staff members, not the social structure. Yeah? And therefore, professionals were made responsible for their own individual racial prejudices. This focus on implementation in the policy, segregated the policy from its inherent racism. Okay, it placed the responsibility on each one of you. So a racist referral, if you made one, wasn't about prevent. The problem wasn't prevent. The problem was you. It's the individual who's making the referral. So my question to you is, the government eventually accepted that there might be the possibility that some people out there, some professionals out there, might be a little bit racist. It was just possible. And that perhaps just regular Muslim practices like going to the mosque or growing a beard, perhaps so-called Muslim practices, might be risk factors. How could they not? Let's have a think. A survey of 5,000 Britons found that 1/3 would rather not have a mosque built near them. A study of 5,000 Britons found that 1/3 believed Islam presented a threat to the British way of life. Research shows that we embody threat in the public consciousness. Large segments of the population, as evidenced by the rise of reform, the Farage riots, espoused ethno-nationalist, xenophobic, and racist beliefs. Just look at social media and you'll see not just Muslims, but all people, generally people of black and Asian communities, are seen almost as being predisposed to violence, and therefore we're undeserving. We cannot be victims of occupation the same way white people can or Europeans can. It's assumed that our natural destiny or perpetual condition is war or violence. There's been a 330% rise in hate crime, I hate that term, hate crime, against Muslims. 2/3 of the attacks are on women wearing hijab. The violence is very much targeted. So, can staff in the racialized environment that we're working in, can they separate their own individual opinions from the racialized environment that we live in? I don't know. Staff will draw upon the world around them, sometimes unconsciously, when they determine which one of us here is a radical. The statutory nature of the prevent duty has given prejudicial thought that is now a potential risk factor in this pre-criminal space, institutional and clinical legitimacy. Can we possibly dissociate the individual experience from the nationalism that's widespread in society? I will end there with a quote by the great Akala and just say that the war on terror has marshaled and institutionalized the securitization of Muslims. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's all right. No, you can stay there. That's all right. Whoa, that's loud. Can we turn the volume down a little bit on the main mic? It doesn't like me, or it doesn't like you. Thank you very much for that, Imran. Lots to consider there. Again, we've got some time for some Q&A. It'd be great to get through 2 or 3, maybe more questions. So if you could keep your question as brief as possible, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Do you want to, we'll get a mic to you here.
Hi. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Oh, I feel like a bit of a celebrity. It's right. Okay, I have my question. So the previous government had some very high-profile brown people there, who you'd think they would help, you know, the cause and understand it. And in fact, they were quite vile people, in my opinion. Is there hope that we have now a former human rights lawyer as our Prime Minister, that things like prevent might be scrapped? And there's a challenge to social media who feeds into this kind of story of hate and racism.
You'll need to use that one.
I'm a Yorkshireman. My voice is elevated quite
It won't come through on the video, though. That's the problem. Yeah, just that.
Sure.
Or you can have this.
I've got it. Okay. Yeah. Can everyone hear me okay? I certainly don't have high hopes of that. I think there's far too much currency in what Saeed Avarsi called dinner table Islamophobia. I think it's a very easy and fantastic way to win a lot of votes. So I don't think it's in this government's interests to reverse anything like that. I mean, it was a Labour government that gave us this in the first place. It was Blair and Brown, right? So I'm certainly not particularly hopeful of that, but there may be some kind of rethinking of it. But when a bomb drops or something awful happens, we go back, generally in society, we revert back to the worst manifestations of societal control, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, so. Oh.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll come to you next. Okay, go ahead. You go ahead. That's
Oh,
right.
you want me to go ahead? Okay. Assalamu alaikum, Imran. Thanks for your talk. Just one thing listening to you, I was just wondering about the people that go through the prevent process. How many people are harmed and the trauma and what's being done about that? And the second point I just wanted to share in the room is that with the recent riots, the focus was very much anti-Muslim. Of course, it was race as well. And the EDL focus for a long time has been very much anti-Muslim focused. But what I've noticed in different circles, I was recently in Bristol, there's no mention of that. There's a lot of talk about race, but nothing about, the anti-Muslim focus. So if you could maybe comment on that.
I think calling it Islamophobia is unfashionable. The government refused to recognise Islamophobia as a branch within racism. Sam Harris, famously said Islam is what do you call it, a bag full of terrible ideas, and that the notion of Islamophobia doesn't exist. Racism is a real thing. Islamophobia is just an attempt by Muslims to deflect away any kind of dissent against the faith. I've completely lost my train of thought. My apologies. Just read the second part of your question.
The second part was about the omission of the focus.
Sure.
And the first part was about...
Sure. I think, yeah, so I think in answer to the second part of your question, I think it's very unfashionable to call it Islamophobia. I think just because of that division of racism. But the point is, not all incidents of racism overlap with Islamophobia, and yet all incidents of Islamophobia overlap with incidents of racism. Muslims have become racialized. There are characteristics that people look to that essentially characterize somebody as Muslim. We become the site of racial encryption, I think. So whether it's the hijab or the beard, we've become an identifiable community, even though we're not white, we're not black, we're not South Asian. We span all of those, in terms of the ethnic divide. In terms of trauma, so our project, weirdly, I run a project for South Asian men principally, who've undergone trauma, and many of those have suffered trauma because of Prevent. And guess who tried to fund us to the tune of several $100,000? Prevent, because that's what they were interested in. And our board was like, yeah, take the money, fantastic. But what are we if we do that? What are we saying about our communities? So we refused, and we've been hand to mouth ever since. But, at least we sleep with some level of morality.
Thank you. Sarah.
Hiya. I enter this space as like an abolitionist and really focused on dismantling systems, but also really focused on solutions. Like the question from the first session really resonated with me. And when it comes to Prevent, we situate ourselves in campaigns that are either raising awareness or working to abolish, right? And there's this middle ground in which people who are professionals existing within health, within education, housing, whatever, have become and been forced into positions of being state agents, whether they like it or they don't. And they often have problems with that. Within the raising awareness and the abolishing of Prevent, people are still having to navigate operating within these policies and legislations. And getting rid of and fighting legislation takes such a long time and a lot of resources. So I was wondering, were you aware of any organisations, or are you involved with, who are working with those professionals who have been made state agents, of how to navigate those roles critically as a solution-focused approach to holding those roles, caring about young people and communities? And what role could strategic litigation play in deconstructing the power of prevent within our communities? And I know that's like a huge question.
Huge question.
But yeah.
I'd say that this conference is the first example of something like this I've been to in a long time. I know that Shami Chakrabarti spoke at an event, this must be 2008, 2007, urging communities not to take prevent funding because of the securitization of communities and how it made, you know, as you say, anybody working in state agencies now responsible for, you know, preventing or policing behavior. So it was big business. And it divided Muslim communities because some Muslim communities took the funding. And what it did was it allowed them to say, it's not us. It's those guys at that mosque over there you need to be careful of. And it's very clever and very subtle. It wasn't very subtle at all, what am I talking about? It was blatant, but people, even though they saw through it, still fell for it because it was funding. And, you know, the third sector was desperate. You know, state funding was drying up. And so they took anything that they could. And it's very hard to work in that then, when the money is literally everywhere. It's spread all over the place. In terms of litigation, I think there's been several attempts, hasn't there? I know Liberty have worked with people. I know they certainly supported somebody on this table who went through some trouble with Prevent. So, yeah, I don't know what that action can look like, but we hope at some point, you know, these awakenings, there's a brilliant Frankie Boyle joke where he says, you know, the Americans eventually come back and make movies about all the places that they destroyed, but it's always a story about their own soldiers and how it made them feel bad. You know, maybe one day we'll be sat here and we'll be talking about how terrible Prevent was and the impact that it had, but it doesn't look, I think it's too embedded in mainstream services now that, so I don't know how legislation could work right now apart from on the individual basis because of how they've segregated it from racism as a whole.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got time for one more question. Over there at the back. Can you see?
Who do I choose?
Yeah.
Thank you. I like the term state agent as one of them here, who has done this fantastic training. In the workplace environment, what sort of practical tips would you encourage to use and to employ to sort of not get rid of, but challenge the behaviour in a professional way?
You see, the danger is once you start challenging it, you become the angry brown person at work, and you're subject to all kinds of disciplinaries and investigations. And you know, it doesn't take much, does it, for us to be the angry brown folk? Yeah, it doesn't really. It really doesn't take much. So, you know, other than actually talking to people and wearing, whether it's your identity or your faith, quite proudly, and not shying away from it. You know, I think a lot of people at that time kind of, oh well, I don't go to the mosque, or you know, I mash and peas or whatever. You know, like they had to publicly somehow apologize for their existence by demonstrating how liberal they were. I think hopefully that time has ended and people can just speak openly about who they are. But I don't have an honest solution to that one. I think other than befriending people and trying to gently challenge them. And I think sometimes challenging doesn't mean saying something. Just challenge people through acts of decency that make them think, oh, well, maybe they're not all that bad. But I mean, again, should we have to do that? That's me on the bus, isn't it? Should I smile and just make it very clear that I'm non-threatening? Should I have to police my own behavior? Is that really what this is about? Sorry, I'm terrible with answering these questions. I've got no solutions to anything.
That's okay. Thank you very, very much. Imran Manzoor, everybody, give a round of applause.